whole armor of God.
American KKKs, COINTELPRO affected African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Indigenous people. So you have to ask yourself, why those three groups of people? Because those people are a nation which make up the 12 tribes of Israel. This is why they don't talk about them attacking the Samoans or the Asians. This series is meant to fully show you why you need the whole armor of God. It's not smooth to hear, even worse than scorching noise of keys, scratching the paint off of a car. I'ma give you that truth today. I'm going to inform you on the catastrophic aftermath of the African American, Native American, and Hispanic communities since COINTELPRO was ended by the FBI in 1971. However, tactics are still used today by authorities, and many documents have either been destroyed or remain unpublished to cover evidence up of what really was happening to us. COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, was initiated by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who was infatuated with the daunting legacy of McCarthyism and gave the FBI minions permission to break public privacy rights protected by constitutional law, disrupt and disassemble minority communities to stay oppressed, sabotage the fame and credibility of minority celebrities. Hoover hired highly trained CIA agents recruited by the historical black colleges and universities in America to go undercover into equal rights organizations, to suggest illegal activities, to frame them for crimes committed by the FBI, create mutual suspicion among militants as informants known as snitch jacketing, to create hate from within, hoping to destroy the company from inside out. Neighborhoods due to systematically racism, inflation, the black dollar, more liquor and gun stores appeared on the corners. This was the decade that began the destruction of the so-called black family. Unemployed so-called black men skyrocketed, causing families to break apart, leaving black women to file for welfare, which kept them independent due to the fact that the government would not allow them to get welfare if there was a man present. Do you understand that? You understand that? Let me say it again. Welfare checks in Section 8 was disapproved if you had a man present. So for black men, it was either street life, homelessness. To make matters worse, the American government would not create a new authority branch called the DA, along with new penal systems for drug dealers, that targeted us. America's government had essentially wrote a death sentence for all of us. All of the blacks, Latin, and Native Americans to destroy themselves by suicide, by self-destruction. That's what America does. Here's a crazy little fact for y'all. The iconic afro in the 70s that we all mimic and mock was actually a rebellious hairstyle, and police identified blacks with the hairstyle as militant. Also, Native Americans with feathers in their head were considered militant as well. Now just look at where these people live and how they did us from the ground to the floor. The so-called Native Americans' unemployment rate was 10 times of the national average, and 40% of the Native Americans' population lived below poverty line in the 1970s. Conditions on Native reservations were similar to those found in third world countries of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Life expectancy of the reservation was just 44 years old. Due to smallpox, due to pneumonia, due to alcoholism. Now this is the kicker. The FBI's war on black-owned bookstores. At the height of the Black Power movement, the Bureau focused on the unlikeliest of public enemies, the black appendant booksellers. In the spring of 1968, the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover announced to his agents that COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program established in 1956 to combat communism, should focus now on preventing the rise of a black messiah who sought to unify and to electrify intensify the militant black nationalist movement. The program Hoover insisted should target figures ideologically diverse at the Black Power activist Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad. Now, these are the people that's being targeted. Just a few months later, in October 1968, Hoover penned another memo warning of the urgent menace of the growing Black Power movement. But this time, the directors focused on the unlikeliness of Public Enemy's The Black Independent Bookseller. In a one-page directive, Hoover noted with alarm a recent increase of establishing black extremist bookstores, which represent propaganda outlets for revolutionary and hating publications and culture centers of extremism. The director ordered each borough office to locate and identify black extremists and African-type bookstores in its territory and open separate, discrete investigations on these bookstores. And now just think about this. Just think about this. You want to educate yourself and learn who you are. And that is enough for them to investigate you and set you up. The director ordered each borough office to locate and identify black extremists. Just think about that. Each investigation was determined to identify of the owners, whether it is a front of any group or foreign interest, whether the individuals affiliated with the store engaged in extremist activity, the number, the type, and the source of the books and the materials on sale, the store's financial conditioning. It's everything. It wanted to know everything this store was doing. Perhaps the most disturbing, Hoover wanted the borough to convince African American citizens, presumably with pay or through extortion, to spy on these stores by posing as being sympathetic customers or activists. Investigation should be situated on new stores when opened. You should recognize the store owner and know everything about it. You should recognize the excellent target these stores represent for presentation by racial sources. He ordered Hoover, in short, expecting agents to adopt the ruthless tactics of espionage and falsification they deployed against civil rights and black power activists, now used on these black store owners. So this is a letter, and I'm putting this up here for you to read yourself. And this is the bureau actually admitting all that they was doing. So this is why the armor of God is needed. This is what you're up against. Where you want to educate yourself or learn who you are is a matter of national security. Like the Black Panther feeding the kids was a matter of national security. There was even a reporter that said one time that the Black Panthers made the government look bad because they was feeding blacks and the government hadn't. Like, that's how much control. They don't even want us feeding our kids. Why ain't they like that with the Asians? Why is it just like that with our people? You need to open your eyes and understand what you're up against and put on the whole armor of God. Now, this is a little bit of a reading from a Hoover memo. It is troubling to say the least. Of the forgotten dimensions of COINTELPRO, one of the escape notices for decades, the FBI's war on black bookstores. In addition to Hoover's memo, I uncovered documents detaining bureau surveillance of black bookstores in at least a half a dozen cities across America. While perhaps not surprising, it is deeply disturbing that Hoover and the FBI would carry out sustained investigations of black-owned independent bookstores across the country as part of COINTELPRO's larger attack on the Black Power movement. But Hoover's order that the agents track these stores' customers represent not just the attack on black activists, but also an absolute contempt for American stated values of freedom of speech and expression. Any citizen who went against anything that they had up, they wanted to get rid of. To be sure, many black bookstores did have direct connections to Black Power activists. Quite a few black booksellers themselves participated in the Black Power organizations, even if those organizations didn't operate their stores, but more often the connections between the bookstores and the movement were institutional. The American Indian movement, known as AIM, formed by young Chippewas in Minnesota, led urban Native Americans along the Trail of Broken Treaties to Washington, D.C., seized the offices of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C., and occupied them for a week under the dramatized Native Grievance in 1972. After the courageous demonstration, the FBI and CIA increased surveillance on the Native American reservations. And in the spring of 1973, a group of 200 heavily armed Native Americans stormed Washington, D.C. and went to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Because this is how crazy this was. Because this is something else you're not going to know. AIM was working with the Black Panthers. It was working with Latino groups. These groups were all coming together, something we can't do to this day, even though we got the same common enemies. We live in the exact same neighborhoods, and we got the exact same struggles. This is why the armor of God is needed. Cocaine was the most lucrative commodity in Latin America in the 70s. But it also became that way for America. Pablo Escobar, blindfolded, worked for the CIA selling coca unknowingly to finance the guerrilla warfare against rumored communism in Central America. Rose up in the miniature Latino kingpins who would be charged life sentences under the RICO Act, filling up American prisons with Hispanics. So it's not just niggles. So let me run that by you again, just in case you're not keeping up. No disrespect, I just need you to understand why this armor is needed so much. So they're pushing drugs in. Then they create new laws to get the drug dealers that are pushing these drugs when they are the real drug dealers. This is what you're up against. Avowed people who don't care about you, and more importantly, they don't care about your kids. You need to waken up and open your eyes so you can see that. Now, just for a recap, kingpins was put in the RICO Act, going to jail for prison, so the crack epidemic can sweep the Latino and African Americans neighborhoods to stop the Black Messiah from coming. That was an actual agenda. A bloody coup led by the CIA agents of Bolivia in 1971 assassinated General Juan Jose, who implemented reforms to benefit workers and those living in poverty. There was a massive resistance by the civilians and loyal soldiers, but the conservative co-op forces had no admiration and killed whoever that did assimilate. In 1973, a smear campaign against the Chaldeans was in full effect, using national and international media to demonize President Salvador Allende by extortion, torture, imprisonment, enforced disappearances, and assassinations. The CIA and native cooperatives in the country attempted to destabilize the country after President Allende national natural resources. The cooperative military infiltrated the president's palace and bombed it with the backing of the CIA. Let's just think that they killed millions of people. You will find that COINTELPRO methods and strategy were used in countries around the world and later in the future after seeing the effects that it had in the 1970s on our people. For instance, the past decade, America's foreign policy in 2011 during the Obama administration, whose rate was high for these tactics. There was an operation in Libya demonized Gaddafi as director, who was anointed as king since the 1970s. And massive propaganda campaigns saturated with his swept world psychologically making the people of Libya assassinate their own king. Since the death of Gaddafi, America wiped their hands clean from the situation, and slavery became the country's new commodity, selling black people who were loyal to their king. Massive propaganda campaigns saturated with lies swept the world, psychologically making the people of Libya assassinate their own king. I had to say it again. Since the death of Gaddafi, Americans wiped their hands clean from the situation, and slavery became the country's new commodity, selling black people who were loyal to the king and didn't believe in the revolution for $400 American each. It's cheap to be a sellout. COINTELPRO is how the FBI has a 98% conviction rate. Nothing is new under the American sun. It's like we were frozen in the 1970s, because not much has changed. The oppressed minorities of the country are still sleeping from the radioactive fallout suppression of the 1970s. Now, this is different things you can check out. COINTELPRO 2005. Encyclopedia of Intelligence. Just check these things out. They'll give you a deeper look at what I'm talking about. And this will tell you why the whole armor of God is being used. Now, these people had a lot of the armor of God, but the main thing they didn't have was these laws, statutes, and commandments. And that's a big missing piece of the armor of God. Because without that, your physical stance and your psychological stance will be non and void. So you got to put on the whole armor of God, because of these people you have no idea. This is just what they've admitted to so far. And you know, every 20 years they admit to some stuff. Amidst the urban unrest of July-August 1967, the FBI began COINTEL Black Hate, which focused on King and SCLC, as well as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating, also the Nation of Islam. It also focused on. Again, to beat this in your brain, customers sought out copies of such titles as The Autobiography of Malcolm X or Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, which bookstores gladly sold them. The rapid proliferation of black-owned bookstores in the late 1960s and the early 1970s signaled something great for the black community. Black-owned bookstores also sold works by authors who were not formally associated with black power organizations, including critically acclaimed writers such as James Baldwin and Lorraine Hansberry, as well as street literature favorites like Iceberg Slim. But this shit should tell you, anything we do, any kind of good thing we do, they attacked us. You understand this? I guarantee you they didn't care about Iceberg Slim's pimp. I guarantee you they didn't care about that being sold. But anything that gave us any type of hope, anytime we got a little glimpse of hope, a little bit of faith, they want to take it. The Drum and the Spear bookstore in Washington, D.C., they really attacked them. They got the most scrutiny. The Burroughs Angels, any black bookstore established by veterans of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the famed Direct Action Civil Rights organization founded in the 1960s. The store opened in late spring 1968, just weeks after the uprising devastated the district following the assassination of Martin Luther King. So this is the birth of this book after they done killed Martin Luther King. The store was especially convenient and frequent target for the federal law enforcement, both because of its ties to prominent figures in the Black Power movement and its location in Columbia Heights neighborhoods, less than 3 miles away from the FBI headquarters. So they took it personal. They felt like these people are in our backyard. This is what these people felt like. And if they was doing that then what are they doing right now? Gotta ask yourself that. You think these people done stopped? We're still getting killed in these streets. They definitely haven't stopped. The Bureau launched the surveillance of Drum and Spear after sources cited Stokely Carmichael, visiting the store in its first weeks of business. Hoover's office soon ordered that the investigation of the store should be intensified beyond occasional visits by agents and expanded to cultivating customers, employees, and people who attended meetings at Drum and Spear. As undercover sources from 1968 until the store's closing in 1974, the Bureau compiled nearly 500 pages of investigative files of Drum and Spear. Plainclothes agents who visited the store aroused employees' suspicion when they sat in the parking lots in front of the business for hours. In another incident, they came in and tried to buy the store's whole inventory. Agents' reports meticulously detailed the store's content, relating that its roughly 4,000 copies and 500 titles were divided into 5 sections: African works, work of American Negro fiction, third world, and children's works. While posters and photos of H.R. Rapp and others stood in the back, Hoover was right about one thing, though. Black bookstores were on the rise by the end of the 1960s. As late as 1966, black-owned bookstores operated in fewer than a dozen American cities, and most of them struggled to stay in business. Within just a few years, however, the number of stores had skyrocketed. Dozens of new stores opened throughout the country in the final years of the 60s, roughly tripling their numbers. Started a decade, as the New York Times reported in 1969, a surge of book buying is sweeping through the black communities across the country, where had been about a dozen bookstores in the mid-60s grew to over 50 and was about 75 by year 1975. Who knows what these people did to get these stores up and running? They life savings for it to be taken away. Because in Hoover's eyes, black-owned bookstores represented coordinated network of hate-spewing extremists. His clumsy invocation of the phrase African-type bookstores betrayed his lack of understanding of Pan-Africanism, the philosophy of the people of African descent around the world should unite. And I know we ain't African, but these people were trying to search for something to hold on to. Radical anti-government organizations actively fomented the black Americans' growing fascination with Africa in the hopes of using it as a weapon against whites, but Hoover grossly mischaracterized the organic groundswell of popular interest in African history, culture, and political spreading throughout African American communities. Because we was tired of living like Esau, so we stretching for something. The FBI appeared to have wound down its surveillance of black bookstores by the middle of the 1970s in the wake of Hoover's death and the formal conclusion of COINTELPRO as the Black Power movement declined in the late 1970s. So did the black bookstores. So they did their job. So as you've seen, once the interest of bookstores went down, they would agree. As if the Bureau's investigation may have undermined the viability of these black-owned businesses, creating undue stress for owners already struggling to make ends meet and scaring away customers who wanted to avoid encounters with law enforcement officials. Indeed, the FBI's war against black bookstores represent a sad chapter in the history of law enforcement in the U.S. at the time. See, this is why the whole armor is needed, y'all. Because for reading books, you guys are being followed. You guys are being questioned. It's intimidation from the church bombings in the 60s and 70s. Don't want you to know God. Don't want you to study too much because you could have come across the fact you're a Hebrew Israelite. That's what they don't want to happen. So these wicked people will come at you for trying to better yourself.
State's Attorney's police arrived at Fred Hampton's West Side apartment, half a block from Panther headquarters, at 4:45 this morning. They had a search warrant authorizing them to look for illegal weapons. The State's Attorney's office says its men were fired upon after identifying themselves at the door, and that Hampton and another man were killed in the 15-minute gun battle which followed. 2 policemen and 4 of the 9 people in the apartment were wounded. Hampton's body was found in bed. Panther Bobby Rush charges it was the raiding party, not the Panthers, who did the shooting.
Murder. Pigs murdered Deputy Chairman Fred Hampton while he lay in bed. I prove it to the world that Fred Hampton was murdered by the pigs. Their lives, their organs to the people can't bear up to the evidence that we...
They fired no shots until they were fired at. They called for a ceasefire on at least 3 different occasions.
Thereafter, 3 times, Sergeant Groth ordered all his men to cease firing and told the occupants to come out with their hands up. Each time, one of the occupants replied, "Shoot it out." And they continued firing at the police officers.
By their own testimony, they admit that for 12 minutes, for 12 solid minutes in those early morning hours, there was gunfiring in that apartment. And yet the federal grand jury concludes that only one possible shot could have.
On December 4th, 1969, a select unit of the 14 Chicago police officers under the direction of Cook County State Attorney Edward Herrera executed a pre-dawn raid on West Side apartment that left Illinois Black Panther Party member Fred Hampton and Mark Clark dead. Several other young Panthers wounded and 7 raid survivors arrested on bogus attempted murder charges. 14 police officers. The FBI had in fact played a central role in the assassinations, and Herrera's initial lies were only the top layer of what was proved to be a massive cover-up. In the wake of the raid, Illinois Black Panther Party Minister of Defense Bobby Rush stood on the steps of the bullet-riddled apartment and declared that J. Edgar Hoover and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were responsible for the raid. At that time, Rush had no hard proof to back up his claims. Over the course of the next 8 years, however, activists and lawyers, including myself, proved that this was true. Now, these guys got agents. They may look like you and me, but they ain't us. They are what Judas was to Christ. Now let's read this one more time. In the wake of the raid, Illinois Black Panther Minister of Defense Bobby Rush stood on the steps of the bullet-riddled apartment and declared that J. Edgar Hoover and the Federal Bureau of Investigation were responsible for the raid. At the time, Rush had no hard proof to back up his claims. Over the course of the next 8 years, however, activists and lawyers, including myself, would eventually discover the truth. The FBI had in fact played a central role in the assassination, and Herrera's initial lies were put in his face and blasted. The first evidence to support Rush's allegation surfaced on March 1971 when a group of anonymous activists who called themselves citizens commissioned to investigate the FBI broke into a small FBI office. And these are the whistleblowers, y'all. They got more than 1,000 documents. In doing so, the commission exposed the FBI's dirty tactics. It's investigating and disrupt the central political groups of the United States. According to the commission's purloined documents, Hoover had directed all the Bureau's office to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize African American organizations and leaders, including the Southern Christians Leadership Conference. Now you gotta think about all these people that they're coming at. Who's strong enough to stand up to that? This is why you need the whole armor of God. 2 years later, it was publicly revealed in an unrelated case that Chicago's Black Panther Perry Chief of Security William O'Neill was a paid informant.
It was an attack on the entire black movement, and particularly on the Panthers, and it talked about disrupting, destroying, and neutralizing the Panthers by any means necessary. And one of their objectives was prevent the rise of a Messiah who could unify and electrify the black masses. Fred Hampton, at 21, was a tremendously charismatic and powerful figure in Chicago. He could talk to welfare mothers, gang kids, and he could talk to law students and college students. He had the ability to pull people together. You got a little glimpse of that in what the clip that you saw. But he made people believe in themselves. He made people feel powerful, and that they could bring about change. And that was his real threat. And so we knew there was this program to prevent the rise of Messiah. We knew about the floor plan. Then we uncovered a document that they gave the informant a bonus after the raid because his information was invaluable to the success of the raid. So internally, the FBI actually took credit for this raid, for the results that Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were killed.
Talk about Willie O'Neill.
William O'Neill was he was uncovered because he became a witness in another case. And I guess we all knew William O'Neill. He was a very flamboyant person, and I guess my idea of an informant was somebody who sits quietly in the corner and takes mental notes. That was not William O'Neill. He was a provocateur. He built an electric chair that was supposedly to threaten potential informants in the party when he was an informant. He attempted to build what he called a rocket that would go from the Panther office to City Hall until Fred Hampton...
What's his position in the Black Panthers?
He was the chief of security, and at one point he was Fred Hampton's bodyguard. And he was present the night of the raid and left. And there was evidence that Fred Hampton was drugged, and he's never admitted it, but some of that evidence suggests that O'Neill was the one who drugged him the night. He attempted to build what he called a rocket that would go from the Panther office to City Hall until Fred Hampton...
What's his position in the Black Panthers?
He was the chief of security, and at one point he was Fred Hampton's bodyguard. And he was present the night of the raid and left. And there was evidence that Fred Hampton was drugged, and he's never admitted it, but some of that evidence suggests that O'Neill was the one who drugged him the night of the raid.
I want to ask, get your response to Cook County State's Attorney Edward Hanrahan. After the raid, he repeatedly claimed the Panthers had opened fire in the place. This is how he described what happened.
The immediate, violent, criminal reaction of the occupants in shooting at announced police officers emphasizes the extreme viciousness of the Black Panther Party. So does their refusal to cease firing at the police officers when urged to do so several times.
That was Ed Hanrahan, the Cook County State's Attorney. Your response to him, and also what happened to Hanrahan as you sought to pursue the truth of the murder of Fred Hampton?
When we gathered the evidence, and you can tell which way a bullet enters from the smaller hole and exits with a larger hole and the wood splayed outward, it became clear that, as I said, 90 shots came in and at most one, a vertical shot, went out. The Panthers were smart enough to invite the community in. The police never sealed it. And the black community, which had been divided on the Panthers, was not divided on the fact that a young man was murdered in his bed, a young leader, at 4:30 in the morning. So there was a tremendous reaction. And Hanrahan became defensive and told the story that you just saw. And later on, he even went further and said, well, Fred Hampton personally was firing at the police. And he gave the Chicago Tribune a photograph. The photograph had 2 black dots on it, and he says, these are the gunshots that Fred Hampton fired. We invited the press out there. It turns out those dots were nail heads. And I think that was the beginning of the end of Edward Hanrahan. He never got elected to anything again. Even a Republican was elected state's attorney of Cook County, which was unheard of. He ran for mayor, he ran for congressman, and basically his political career ended on December 4th, just at the time when he thought it would rise.
Context with Jeffrey Huss, but in 1969, you were one of the leaders of the Columbia student protest, one of the founders of the Young Lords. What was the effect 40 years ago today? Where were you on this day?
I remember very well the news coming about Fred Hampton's death. And of course, as you mentioned, his ability to unite people. Very few people are aware that Fred Hampton was the original creator of the concept of the Rainbow Coalition that a young Jesse Jackson then adopted later, because he was building unity between the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and some white radical organizations in Chicago, and he called them the Rainbow Coalition, which is what Jesse then adopted into as his main program. But he had this ability to unite all kinds of different groups, as you say, racial groups, as well as across economic lines. And in terms of the legacy of Hampton, obviously Bobby Rush, who later became a congressman in Chicago, still is a congressman. What has been in Chicago the way that the political establishment has dealt with the reality of this assassination and of the historical impact of Fred Hampton?
Well, I think for one thing it marked the independence of the black political leaders in Chicago, who had up until then had been pretty much lackeys of the mayor and the Democratic machine. And a young state senator named Harold Washington spoke out, and Danny Davis spoke out, and Jesse Jackson welcomed Bobby Rush. And all of a sudden you had an independent and much more progressive.
For the following 2 years, we focused on unearthing further details about the FBI's involvement in the conspiracy and sought the Chicago office's COINTELPRO file in order to establish a direct link between the FBI's program and the raid. When the government would not produce the file and the district court judge Joseph Sam Perry refused to compel them to do so, we turned to the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations for help. A staff member of the committee, which was created in the wake of Watergate scandal to investigate rampant abusers by all United States intelligence agencies, including the FBI, informed us in late 1975 that there were several documents in Chicago office definitely establishing the link we sought. Armed with this information, we were able to persuade the judge to hear what we had to say. This judge had previously declared those documents irrelevant after privately reviewing them until ordering the FBI to produce the file. And just as the select committee had promised, the documents revealed the FBI's efforts to foment violence against Fred Hampton and the Chicago Panthers. One document specifically classified the anticipated raid on the West Side apartments as part of the COINTELPRO program. In January 1976, our team embarked on what would turn out to be the longest civil trial in federal court history. 2 months in, O'Neill's FBI control agent, Roy Mitchell, blundered on the witness stand and inadvertently indicated that the FBI had not actually produced all the Chicago Black Panther files. Judge Perry, likely knowing what was about to happen, ordered that they do so. The next day, a shaken agent came in and had over many documents. The government spent the next 2 weeks producing several valuable documents each day. The files contained derivatives to destroy the Black Panthers Breakfast for Children program, and disrupt the distribution of the Black Panthers newspaper, extensive wiretaps over years, and evidence that the charismatic Hampton had been specifically targeted for intensive surveillance and disruption. It was also found that the FBI and the government obstructed justice by suppressing the Black Panther files. The Court of Appeals also concluded that there was a substantial evidence to support the conclusion that the FBI defendants in the planning and executing the raid had participated in conspiracy designed to subvert and eliminate Fred Hampton. Now, you heard the documents, you heard what the whistleblowers had to say. So what say you? Do you understand that the whole armor of God is needed? Do you understand what you're up against? I assure you still don't. Even with all this, you still don't quite understand. Because this is only what we know. This is only what we know. They killed Fred Hampton, not because he was violent, but because he was nonviolent. Not because he was a drug addict, but because he wasn't a drug addict. Now you see why all these drugs are in our neighborhood. You need the whole armor of God to survive that. Still not convinced? According to author Deborah Davis, Operation Mockingbird recruited leading American journalists into propaganda networks influenced in the operation in front groups. CIA support of the front groups were exposed when 1967 Ramparts magazine article reported that the National Student Accusation received money. Do you understand this? Do you get it? Do you get that the journalists are working for these people. You know, never quite understood why you never got a fair shake in court. You never got a fair shake in no aspects of life in America, because these people are after you. And they won't let up because they know it means the end of them. Now, as far as this crack goes, that they pushed in our neighborhood, these drugs they pushed in our neighborhood, Fred Hampton is the reason why. At age 21, he had hospitals, he had schools, and he was organizing with the Latinos and the Native Americans and some white groups.
I don't want to blame this all on the media. Of course, it's not. We're talking in the first instance about federal agencies and what laws might have been broken. But the fact of the matter is the media has a long and distinguished track record here of suppression. And that's why we're here today. So I would just answer it that simply. The scandal involves the media, so the media is not interested in investigating themselves.
That has enabled this story to become the most talked about story of the year, even when the mainstream papers have tried to. You can go to the Kerry Committee report, 1,166 pages. You can go to the National Security Archives, where all the North Notebook entries that Joe mentioned are cited. You can go back to the original 1985 AP report, and we've got the numbers of the two reporters, Robert Parry and Brian Barger, right here. This isn't our allegations. This is the allegations on the CIA's own records and on this country's congressional committee documents. So we won't let the newspapers deny what we've documented and what the CIA themselves have documented over the years. We won't.
The revelations were explosive. Reagan denied the allegations that he had negotiated with terrorists. But Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North came forward and acknowledged that he diverted funds to the Contras. North also said Reagan knew about it. North's testimony would inspire the press and Congress to launch investigations against Reagan for the rest of his presidency. Texas Senator John Tower led the investigation into the scandal. The Tower Commission determined it was Reagan's lack of oversight that allowed Iran-Contra to happen, but did not implicate Reagan directly. It wasn't until another congressional investigation in 1987 that Reagan finally testified. On May 5th, 1987, joint hearings were televised investigating the covert arms deal with Iran and the assistance to Nicaragua. The hearings would go on for 41 days. Reagan was never charged, but McFarlane, Oliver North, 4 CIA officers, 5 government contractors, and Reagan's national security advisor, John Poindexter, were all found guilty. Yet, speculation about Reagan's involvement lingered on. Press investigations would go on for years to follow. While Reagan's image suffered a bit, he still left office with one of the highest approval ratings of any president in U.S. history.